You call this professionalism? Richard Harper's voice rang across the marble lobby, cutting sharper than the sound of heels on polished stone. He stood there with his daughter clinging to his hand, glaring at Maria Alvarez, on her knees, crawling across the floor like a dinosaur, her mop bucket parked nearby. A few security guards chuckled. Even the receptionist hid a smirk. Maria lifted her head, meeting his scorn without flinching. "You think all I do is clean floors?" Her voice was calm, steady. "Then maybe you should check what your cameras just recorded. If you're tired of the powerful humiliating the people who keep their world running, hit subscribe right now. Because this story isn't about staying invisible," Richard scoffed, tugging his little girl back. "Pathetic. My daughter doesn't need a janitor's company." But Maria didn't retreat. Her hands trembled faintly, not from shame, but from holding herself back. To him, she was nothing but a uniform, a bucket, and a paycheck scraped at the bottom. What he couldn't see, what none of them could, was the truth buried in her silence. Behind her simple coveralls was a life he couldn't imagine. Long nights in hospital wards, lives pulled back from the brink, a calling that cost her everything and forced her to walk these halls unseen. For now, her pulse slowed as she steadied her breath, her eyes drifting to Evelyn Harper's bright face. The child had laughed with her moments ago, delighted by the silly dinosaur game. Now, the laughter was gone, replaced by confusion as her father dragged her away, like she was a prop in his performance of power. Maria had been dismissed before. She had been ignored before. But this was personal, because the little girl who reached for her hand a moment earlier reminded her of her own daughter, the one she had lost when no one listened. And Richard? He had no idea the wrong person to belittle wasn't the janitor. It was the surgeon hiding inside her. Where are you watching from? Because this lobby showdown is only the beginning, and Richard Harper is about to learn that humiliation is a dangerous game. The scene settles into the main story. Maria Alvarez, single mom, works as a janitor at Harper International's corporate tower. Humble tools in hand, she scrubs the marble floors to keep her modest paycheck steady. But tonight, her dignity is shredded when Richard Harper, CEO, publicly ridicules her for playing along with his daughter's innocent request. The cameras catch everything. Maria crawling across the floor with Evelyn, giggling like any child would. To Richard, it was beneath his image. To Maria, it was a rare spark of joy in a routine of invisibility. The class divide hung in the air. His tailored suit, her faded coveralls, his scorn, her silence. Maria hides a prestigious past. Once a pediatric surgeon, she gave it all up when tragedy struck her family. She never advertised it. She never wanted to. But the echo of her past expertise will surface sooner than anyone expects. The humiliation lingers long after Richard sweeps his daughter away. Maria grips her mop handle like an anchor. She's been overlooked, belittled, shoved aside before. But this cut at her humanity. And the irony burns. One day soon, this man's fortune and status won't save him. Not when his world tilts into crisis, because when that moment comes, the janitor he mocked will hold the only knowledge that can keep his daughter alive. Maria stayed kneeling for a moment after Richard Harper strode away, his expensive cologne lingering like smoke in the air. Her fingers curled tighter around the mop handle until her knuckles whitened, but her face remained calm, unreadable. She couldn't afford to let the sting of humiliation show. Too many eyes had seen the exchange already, and she knew whispers would follow her down every corridor tonight. She rose slowly, steadying her bucket as though nothing had happened, and pushed it across the polished lobby. The echoes of laughter, first Evelyn's joy, then Richard's cruel dismissal, tugged at her chest. Maria's footsteps squeaked lightly against the marble floor, her reflection rippling under the bright corporate lights. Around her, the symbols of wealth loomed, the glass elevator gliding upward, the chandelier dripping with light, the sleek leather couches where junior executives pretended to be busy. She was a fixture here, like the mop itself, necessary but invisible. But invisibility had its uses. Maria had learned long ago that when people think you're nothing, they show you everything. And Richard had shown her more than arrogance tonight. He had revealed a blind spot. His daughter had reached for her, trusted her, laughed with her. That bond wasn't something money could command. Upstairs, she knew, Richard would return to his corner office. Mahogany desk, skyline view, whiskey decanter, gleaming under recessed lights. He would probably boast to his colleagues about putting a janitor in her place, his words dripping with pride. Maria pictured it clearly, because she had once sat in offices like his, not as a cleaner, but as a professional called in for expertise. Back then, she hadn't needed to prove her worth, but that life had ended abruptly, sealed off like a closed wing of a hospital. No one dared reopen. She parked her bucket near the service closet and leaned her mop inside. The building hummed with its nighttime rhythm, elevators chiming, printers spitting paper, the muted thump of heels on tile. Maria tugged her gloves off slowly, each snap reminding her of another life. Sterile gloves, operating lights, the soft rush of oxygen as a child clung to life on a table. She shook the memory off before it swallowed her whole. When she stepped back into the lobby, she noticed the security guards glancing her way again. One whispered to another, and both chuckled. Maria ignored them, but her jaw tightened. Richard's arrogance had fed them license, permission to treat her like a sideshow. For now, she let them laugh. She had bigger battles to fight than pride. As she wheeled her cart toward the elevator, she passed a group of junior staffers, huddled by the vending machine. Their chatter carried in the cavernous space. "Did you see the janitor crawling like a clown?" one said. "Mister." Harper nearly exploded. The others snickered, shaking their heads. Maria kept walking, her back straight, though every word pricked like a thorn. Her shift still had hours to go. She rode the service elevator down to the basement level, where the air smelled of bleach and old concrete. The break room buzzed faintly with a vending machine light, a few tired cleaners sipping coffee from paper cups. Maria sat apart, pulling her lunch from a worn canvas bag, a simple sandwich wrapped in foil. Across from her, an older custodian named Beatrice glanced up. "You all right, honey? I heard Harper gave you an earful," Beatrice murmured, her tone heavy with sympathy. Maria managed a small smile. "I've heard worse." Beatrice frowned, but didn't press. In this line of work, everyone carried a story. Some were visible in their eyes. Others stayed buried. Maria's story was one she had sworn to keep locked away. By the time she returned upstairs, the lobby was quieter. The receptionist had left, replaced by a night clerk scrolling his phone. Maria cleaned steadily, her motions practiced, efficient, her mind circling the sting of humiliation again and again. Richard's dismissal wasn't just a passing insult, it carried weight. In a building like this, image was everything. His words could make her life harder in subtle ways. Extra inspections, complaints about her work, whispers that she didn't belong. Still, she reminded herself of the truth he didn't know. The mop in her hand was temporary. Her uniform was temporary. The skill that had once defined her could not be erased, no matter how many nights she spent scrubbing marble floors. And though she had buried that part of herself, she felt it stir tonight, like a pulse returning to life. At one point, Maria caught sight of Evelyn again, darting down a corridor with a nanny chasing after her. The little girl paused, spotting Maria across the lobby, and waved. It was a small, innocent gesture, but it carried warmth enough to cut through the cold marble air. Maria lifted her hand in return, her chest tightening. Children had always trusted her, sensed something steady in her presence. That bond, simple, unspoken, mattered more than any CEO's approval. Richard didn't notice. He never would. He was too busy believing that his wealth shielded him from ever needing anyone like Maria. But the truth was already in motion, ticking closer with every heartbeat. For now, Maria scrubbed in silence, her reflection sliding over the glass doors as executives hurried past without a glance. She let them see only what they wanted, a cleaner, invisible, irrelevant. But inside, the old instincts sharpened, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. Because humiliation wasn't the end of this story. It was the trigger. And soon, this building would discover just how dangerous it was to underestimate the woman who cleaned their floors. Maria's shift dragged on, every movement of her mop an echo of Richard Harper's mocking voice. Pathetic, he had called her, like her very existence was an embarrassment under the polished glass of his empire. Yet she pressed forward, sweeping, scrubbing, her body mechanical, while her mind replayed every second of humiliation. The sting was sharp, but beneath it, something else stirred, a quiet resolve she hadn't felt in years. As she rounded a corner toward the executive wing, she caught the faint hum of laughter spilling from a half-open door. Richard's voice carried easily, smooth and confident, punctuated by the clinking of ice in a glass. She slowed, her cart rattling against the tile, and caught fragments of his words. Imagine that woman crawling on my lobby floor. Like a circus act, Evelyn deserves better than to play with staff. The laughter of his colleagues followed, a chorus of agreement. Maria pushed her cart on before they noticed her. The sound chased her down the hall, each chuckle another weight pressing against her chest. She had lived her life measured in such moments, people deciding her worth with a smirk, a whisper, a dismissal. But tonight, something in her refused to bend. She paused near the large windows at the end of the corridor. The city glittered below, cars threading the streets like veins of light. Once, she had stood at windows like these in another world, exhausted but proud, after 12-hour shifts in sterile halls. She had worn her name embroidered in white, spoken with authority, guided parents through fear with steady words. She had been Dr. Maria Alvarez. That name no longer existed here, but the knowledge hadn't vanished. And when she thought of Evelyn's small hand reaching for hers earlier, Maria knew the past would not stay buried forever. The sound of hurried footsteps snapped her back. A young intern rushed past her, papers spilling from an overloaded folder. He mumbled an apology without looking at her, stooped to gather the scattered sheets, then ran off again. Maria knelt, picking up one page left behind. It was a schedule of the next day's executive meetings. Richard Harper's name in bold at the top. He would be presenting quarterly numbers, the kind of event that demanded flawless image. She folded the page and tucked it into the cart, not as a plan, but as a reminder. His empire ran on appearances, and appearances could crumble. In the staff lounge, Maria rinsed her rag, the water turning gray as dust swirled away. Beatrice looked up from her crossword. Still thinking about it, aren't you? Maria forced a smile. He's not worth the energy. But Beatrice knew better. Men like Harper, they think money makes them kings. But I've seen kings fall, always because they never expect the ground to give way. Maria nodded faintly. She didn't say it aloud, but she felt it. The ground was already shifting. Later, as midnight neared, she moved through the top-floor lobby again. The hall was empty now, the earlier laughter replaced by silence. Her reflection, stretched tall in the polished glass doors, mop in hand like a weapon disguised as a tool. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine Richard's face when the truth finally cracked through his arrogance. Not revenge, but recognition. That was all she wanted. Dignity restored, not for herself alone, but for every worker dismissed as nothing. She returned to her duties, emptying trash bins and wiping down handrails. It was monotonous, but her mind stayed sharp, tracing old patterns. The precision of her movements echoed the precision of surgeries she had once performed. Steady hands, deliberate choices, every detail accounted for. Cleaning and medicine weren't so different. Both demanded patience. Both often went unnoticed until failure appeared. When she stepped back into the main lobby, she saw Evelyn again. The little girl sat on a bench near the glass wall, her nanny distracted with a phone. Evelyn's eyes lit up when she saw Maria, and she waved again with both hands. Maria smiled despite herself and crossed the lobby, crouching near the bench. "Shouldn't you be upstairs, little one?" Maria whispered. Evelyn giggled. "Daddy says I'm not supposed to bother you." Maria's chest tightened. She glanced at the nanny, still scrolling, oblivious. "You're not bothering me," Maria said softly. "Not at all." Evelyn leaned closer. "I like dinosaurs." Maria chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. The warmth in Evelyn's eyes cut through the heaviness of the night. Children didn't see uniforms or class divides. They saw only kindness. A sharp voice interrupted. "Evelyn!" Richard's figure appeared from the elevator, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Maria crouched nearby. He strode forward, his suit jacket crisp, his expression cold. "How many times must I remind you? She's staff. You don't play with staff." Evelyn shrank back, her small hands curling into her lap. Maria stood slowly, her gaze steady, refusing to be cowed this time. Richard's eyes flicked to her, hard and dismissive. "I'll be speaking to management." "Don't think I won't." Maria's lips pressed into a thin line, but inside she felt the flicker of steel. Let him speak. Let him laugh. His fortress of arrogance was built on glass, and the cracks were already forming. She turned back to her cart, rolling it toward the service corridor. Behind her, Evelyn's small voice rose faintly. "She's nice, Daddy." Maria didn't look back, but the words followed her, soft as a promise. The bond was real. And when the storm came, and Maria could feel it building, it would be that bond that changed everything. Maria wheeled her cart down the service corridor, Evelyn's words echoing in her ears. "She's nice, Daddy." So small, so unguarded. Yet it had slipped through Richard Harper's carefully polished world like a stone through glass. He hadn't replied, but Maria had seen his jaw tighten, his hand clench around the strap of his briefcase. For all his power, he couldn't control his daughter's honesty. That truth gnawed at him, more than he'd ever admit. The service elevator groaned as Maria rode it down to the basement. The walls smelled faintly of metal and old paint, a stark contrast to the perfumed lobbies above. She stepped out into the quiet, parked her cart by the janitorial station, and rubbed the back of her neck. Every muscle felt taut, strung like wires. She had learned to let insults wash off her, to survive unnoticed, but Richard's disdain had cut deeper. Not because of his words alone, but because Evelyn was caught in the middle, forced to see kindness framed as weakness. Maria washed her hands at the utility sink, the water rushing over her skin, reminding her of scrubbing before surgeries, rituals that once defined her life. She dried her hands slowly, staring at the pale scars across her knuckles. No amount of bleach or labor could erase what she had been. The memory pressed close, but she forced herself to push it back. Tonight wasn't the night for revelations. Not yet. When she returned upstairs, the building had thinned. Executives had left in sleek cars, their laughter trailing into the night. The lobby lights dimmed to their nighttime glow. The hum of air vents filled the silence. Maria worked steadily, moving through each floor, wiping glass walls, dusting endless rows of chairs, emptying trash bins stuffed with paper cups and crumpled notes from meetings. On the 12th floor, she paused at a conference room where the lights still burned. Through the glass wall, she saw Richard at the head of the table, alone now, reviewing charts projected on a massive screen. His jacket was off, his tie loosened, but his posture radiated control. A half-empty glass of whiskey glistened by his hand. He leaned forward, tapping a pen against the table, frowning at red lines trending downward. Maria lingered a moment too long. Richard looked up, eyes catching her through the glass. He held her gaze, unblinking, then smirked faintly before turning back to his work. It wasn't the smirk of amusement this time. It was a warning, a reminder that in his world, she was tolerated only so long as she stayed in her place. She moved on quickly, her heart beating harder. Yet beneath the unease, a quiet satisfaction grew. For all his money and power, Richard couldn't escape his own burdens. The numbers on his screen told a story he couldn't silence with arrogance. The empire wasn't as untouchable as he wanted the world to believe. By the time her shift neared its end, Maria felt exhaustion creeping in. She gathered her things, ready to head home, when she saw Evelyn again. The child sat on the lobby couch, a stuffed dinosaur clutched in her arms. Her nanny hovered nearby, distracted by another phone call. Evelyn spotted Maria and hurried over, her little shoes tapping against the marble. "You forgot to roar," Evelyn whispered with a grin, holding up the toy dinosaur. Maria chuckled softly. "I'll remember next time." Evelyn's eyes sparkled. "Daddy says you're just the cleaner. But I think you're something else." The words hit Maria like a jolt. Children had a way of seeing what adults couldn't, or refused to. She crouched to meet Evelyn's gaze. "Sometimes being kind is the most important something," she said gently. Before Evelyn could answer, Richard's voice boomed from across the lobby. "Evelyn!" His tone was sharp, cutting through the air. He strode toward them, coat draped over one arm, phone pressed to his ear. "How many times do I have to repeat myself?" "You do not waste time with staff." Evelyn flinched, clutching her toy tighter. Maria rose slowly, meeting Richard's glare. For a moment, she thought he might lash out further, but he stopped short, adjusting his cufflinks as though regaining composure. "Tomorrow," he muttered into his phone, then gestured for Evelyn to follow. The child obeyed reluctantly, glancing back at Maria with wide, questioning eyes. Maria gave her a small smile, steady and reassuring, even as Richard pulled her away. When they were gone, Maria exhaled slowly. She had faced dismissals before, but tonight felt different. The tension coiled tighter, pulling them all toward something inevitable. Richard's arrogance wasn't just cruelty, it was blindness. He didn't see the fragility of his world, didn't understand how quickly power could crumble when confronted by the one thing it couldn't control: life itself. Maria locked her card away, and stepped out into the cool night air. The city buzzed faintly, taxis honking, neon lights glowing against the darkness. She pulled her jacket tighter, heading for the bus stop. Her body was weary, but her mind wouldn't rest. Every detail of the night replayed. The humiliation, the laughter, Evelyn's trust, Richard's disdain. She boarded the bus, finding a seat by the window. As the city blurred past, she thought of her daughter, the one she had lost, the one who had taught her the price of silence. That wound had driven her here, to anonymity, to mops and buckets instead of scalpels and stethoscopes. But life had a way of circling back, forcing truths into the light. Maria leaned her head against the glass, eyes closing. She didn't know when, but she knew how. The moment would come when Richard Harper's wealth and arrogance would mean nothing, when his carefully built empire would be useless against reality. And in that moment, he would have no choice but to look to the janitor he had humiliated. For Evelyn's sake, Maria would be ready. The bus jolted to a stop near Maria's neighborhood, and she stepped into the cool night with a heaviness that clung to her shoulders. The streets here were narrow, lined with cracked sidewalks and the faint hum of flickering street lamps. Her apartment building loomed ahead, paint peeling, the smell of fried food drifting from a window. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And within those walls, she could finally breathe without eyes on her. Inside, she slipped off her shoes, careful not to wake her son. Gabriel was already asleep on the worn couch, his school books scattered across the coffee table. Maria paused, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. He stirred slightly, mumbling in his sleep, and Maria felt a tug at her chest. He was the reason she scrubbed floors until her hands cracked, the reason she swallowed insults without reply. Everything she endured came back to him. She sank into the old armchair across from him, exhaustion pulling at her bones. Yet her mind wouldn't rest. Richard Harper's words still echoed, as sharp as the sting of ammonia on raw skin. Staff. Pathetic. Each insult felt less like an attack on her and more like a lesson Evelyn would carry forward. A belief planted by her father. Maria couldn't let that stand. Not for Evelyn, not for Gabriel, not for herself. The next morning, she rose before dawn. Gabriel sat at the table, spooning cereal while scribbling notes for a science project. "Morning, Mom," he said, his eyes bleary but determined. "Morning, mijo," Maria replied softly, kissing his forehead. She packed his lunch, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. He would never know how much she sacrificed to keep things steady, and she preferred it that way. He deserved a normal childhood, free from the weight she carried. When she arrived back at Harper International, the building shimmered under the early sun. Executives hurried inside, coffee cups in hand, their conversations filled with deadlines and deals. Maria slipped in through the side entrance, invisible once again. Yet as she pushed her cart toward the lobby, she noticed something unusual. Evelyn's laughter drifting down the corridor. The little girl was there, bright-eyed and full of energy, chasing her stuffed dinosaur across the polished floor. The nanny hurried after her, exasperated. Evelyn spotted Maria instantly and darted over, toy in hand. "Roar!" she cried, thrusting the dinosaur forward. Maria chuckled, crouching down. "That's a very fierce roar." Evelyn giggled. "You forgot to roar yesterday?" Maria leaned closer, playfully growling, and Evelyn squealed with delight. The sound lifted something heavy from Maria's chest. She couldn't help noticing the small details. A faint flush on Evelyn's cheeks, the way she pressed her hand against her chest after laughing too hard. Maria's instincts stirred, but she brushed them aside for now. Children tired easily. Before long, Richard appeared, striding across the lobby with his phone pressed to his ear. His voice carried, clipped and impatient. "I don't care what it costs. Fix the numbers before tomorrow." He ended the call abruptly, his eyes narrowing when he spotted Maria near his daughter. "Evelyn!" he snapped. "Come here." The girl hesitated, glancing between them. Maria straightened, her expression calm, unyielding. Richard's jaw tightened, and he pulled Evelyn to his side. "How many times must I repeat myself?" he hissed, his words sharp enough for Maria to hear. "You do not fraternize with staff." Evelyn clutched her dinosaur, her lip trembling. Richard ushered her toward the elevators, but Maria caught the child's faint whisper. "She's my friend." Maria's chest constricted. Children didn't lie about what they felt. That bond mattered, no matter how much Richard tried to erase it. The rest of the morning passed in silence, but the seed had been planted. Maria worked with steady focus, her ears tuned to the rhythm of the building. She overheard executives muttering about quarterly losses, about investors circling like vultures. The empire Richard flaunted so proudly was trembling at its foundations. Later, as Maria polished the brass railing by the main staircase, she overheard Beatrice chatting nearby. "You know," Beatrice said to another cleaner, "Harper's not as untouchable as he pretends. Word is, his daughter's been having fainting spells. The nanny's worried. But he brushes it off, too busy with his numbers." Maria froze, rag in hand. Fainting spells. Her stomach tightened. She remembered the flush on Evelyn's cheeks, the hand pressed against her chest. Her instincts screamed louder now. She knew these signs. She had seen them before. She finished her task quickly, her mind racing. Richard's arrogance wasn't just hurting employees, it was putting his daughter at risk. And when that risk turned real, no amount of money, power, or polished glass walls would save him. That evening, as Maria waited for the bus, she watched the city pulse with life. She could feel it now, a storm brewing. The humiliation, the dismissal, the class divide, all of it was leading towards something neither Richard nor anyone in his circle could control. And when it struck, Maria would be the one standing between arrogance and disaster. She thought of Gabriel, of Evelyn, of every child who deserved better than neglect hidden beneath wealth. She closed her eyes, steadying herself. The moment was coming, and she would be ready. Maria stepped off the bus and into the corporate tower the next morning, her chest tight with a sense of anticipation she couldn't shake. The storm she had felt building was closer now. She could see it in the hurried strides of the executives, in the low murmur of tense conversations echoing through the marble lobby. Something in the air was different, heavier. She wheeled her cart into position, eyes scanning the floor, though her thoughts were elsewhere. On Evelyn, on the faint signs she had noticed, on the whispers about fainting spells that gnawed at her all night. She began her routine with precision, wiping down the glass doors, her rag moving in smooth circles. Around her, the building flaunted its wealth. Designer suits, diamond watches, polished leather shoes clicking across tile. Yet Maria noticed the small cracks beneath the surface, the clenched jaws, the furrowed brows, the quick, anxious glances at phones. For all the polish, Harper International was trembling. The elevators chimed, and Richard Harper emerged with Evelyn at his side, the nanny trailing a step behind. He wore his arrogance like armor, his tie perfectly knotted, his stride unbending. Yet his eyes carried shadows, sleepless nights etched into the corners. Evelyn clutched her stuffed dinosaur in one hand, her other hand gripping her father's tightly. Maria watched as Richard led her toward the elevators again, his phone pressed to his ear. "Investors will not dictate to me," Richard snapped, his voice sharp. "We're not folding. Do what you must. Sell assets. Cut staff. I don't care." He caught sight of Maria near the glass wall, and his expression hardened instantly. He ushered Evelyn closer, as though shielding her from contact. But Evelyn twisted in his grasp, waving to Maria. Her little face was pale, her eyes tired, yet her smile remained. Maria forced a gentle smile back, though worry knifed through her chest. The signs were louder now. Richard didn't see them. He refused to. Hours later, Maria found herself on the executive floor, dusting the railings outside the boardroom. Voices carried through the door, sharp, anxious, strained. "The numbers are catastrophic," one man said. "If the investors pull, we won't recover." Another voice, Richard's, cut through. "I will not let this company collapse." Control the narrative, Maria worked quietly, invisible to the storm raging inside the room. Yet her eyes flicked toward Evelyn, who sat outside with the nanny, legs swinging from a chair, her stuffed dinosaur clutched tightly. The girl's head drooped, her skin pale, her breathing shallow. Maria's heart thudded. She recognized the signs too well. Suddenly, Evelyn slid from the chair, her small body folding to the floor. The nanny gasped, dropping her phone. "Evelyn! Sweetheart!" Panic erupted instantly. Evelyn's toy dinosaur tumbled from her grip as her chest heaved unevenly. Maria's instincts took over before thought. She dropped her rag, crossing the hallway in 3 strides. "Move!" she commanded, her voice low but firm, a tone that startled the nanny into silence. She knelt beside Evelyn, steadying the girl's head, her fingers pressed gently at her neck to find the pulse. It was weak, fluttering like a trapped bird. The boardroom door flung open. Richard stormed out, irritation painted across his face, until he saw his daughter on the floor. "Evelyn!" His voice cracked, sharp with fear. He fell to his knees, shaking her shoulders. "Evelyn, wake up!" "She needs calm, not panic," Maria said sharply, not looking up. Her hands moved with steady precision, tilting Evelyn's head, checking her breathing. She saw the signs: oxygen deprivation, possible congenital issue left unchecked. The memories came rushing back. The bright lights of operating rooms, the urgency of fragile lives in her hands. Richard froze, his eyes wide. "What are you doing?" "Get back." Maria ignored him, pressing gently against Evelyn's chest, stabilizing her airway with practiced skill. "She's struggling to breathe. Call for medical support now. And get me a first aid kit." Immediately, the nanny scrambled to obey. Richard hovered, torn between anger and desperation. "Who do you think you are?" Maria's eyes flashed as she met his gaze. "The only person in this building who knows what to do." Evelyn gasped, her small body shuddering. Maria kept her voice steady, calm. "Stay with me, sweetheart. You're going to be all right." The hallway had drawn a crowd, executives, assistants, even security guards, all frozen in place. Their whispers buzzed like static. Richard Harper, the man who commanded entire boardrooms, was powerless, and the janitor he had mocked now commanded the moment with absolute authority. Maria adjusted Evelyn's position, murmuring soft reassurances as she worked. Each action was precise, born of years of training no one in this building knew she carried. Finally, Evelyn's breathing steadied, shallow but consistent. Her eyelids fluttered open, her gaze unfocused but alive. Relief washed over Maria, but she didn't let her hands shake. She looked up at the nanny. "Ambulance! Now! Tell them pediatric cardiac emergency. Go!" The nanny bolted down the hall. Richard sat frozen beside his daughter, his face pale, his arrogance stripped away. His eyes locked on Maria, and for the first time, there was no disdain in them, only fear. Maria eased Evelyn's head into her lap, brushing the hair from her damp forehead. "You're safe," she whispered. "I've got you." The stuffed dinosaur lay beside them, forgotten. But Maria gently placed it back in Evelyn's hand. The girl's fingers curled weakly around it, and Maria's chest tightened. The executives stood in silence, their world of profits and power rendered meaningless in the face of a child's fragile breath. Maria, once invisible, was now undeniable. And though Richard hadn't spoken a word, Maria knew the truth had already broken through. His money couldn't save Evelyn, but she could. Maria cradled Evelyn in her lap as the sirens drew closer, their wail faint but growing. Around her, the corridor remained frozen, the gathered executives silent, their expensive suits and polished shoes useless against the fragility of a child's breath. Maria's hands moved steadily, monitoring Evelyn's pulse, adjusting her position to keep the airway clear. Her heart raced, but her training steadied her nerves. She had walked this line before, between life and loss, and she would not falter now. Richard knelt across from her, his hand clutching Evelyn's small fingers. His face, usually carved in cold confidence, was pale and trembling. He looked at Maria with eyes that begged for answers but refused to form the words. He had mocked her, dismissed her, humiliated her. Yet in this moment, all that pride cracked under the weight of helplessness. Maria didn't meet his gaze. Her focus was on Evelyn. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice calm but firm. "You're safe." She brushed the child's damp hair from her forehead, grounding herself in the innocence that tethered them together. The elevator chimed and paramedics rushed out with equipment. One knelt beside Maria. "What happened?" Maria shifted smoothly, relaying the details with clinical precision. "Sudden collapse, weak pulse, labored breathing, possible underlying cardiac condition. I stabilized her airway." The words flowed naturally, crisp and authoritative. The paramedics exchanged quick looks, surprised at the accuracy. They moved swiftly, attaching monitors and preparing oxygen. Richard hovered, frantic. "Is she? Will she?" His voice cracked, unable to finish. "She's stable enough for transport," Maria said without looking at him. "But she needs immediate evaluation at the hospital." The paramedics lifted Evelyn onto a stretcher. The child's eyes fluttered, finding Maria as they wheeled her toward the elevator. She squeezed her dinosaur toy and whispered faintly, "Don't go." Maria's chest constricted. She wanted to follow, to stay by the girl's side until safety was certain. But she remained kneeling on the marble, her hands trembling slightly now that the crisis had passed. The paramedics disappeared into the elevator, the doors closing with a sharp clang. The silence that followed was deafening. Dozens of eyes turned to Maria. The janitor on her knees, uniform smeared with dust, hands shaking from the weight of what she had just done. For years, she had scrubbed these halls unseen. Tonight, she had become impossible to ignore. Richard stood slowly, his face ashen. He looked down at her as though seeing her for the first time. His lips parted, but no words came. He turned abruptly and strode after the elevator, his polished shoes echoing against the marble. The crowd dispersed in murmurs, their whispers carrying down the corridor. How did she know all that? She saved her. Wasn't she just the janitor? Maria gathered herself, rising carefully. She collected her rag and cart, moving with quiet composure, though her pulse still pounded in her ears. Later, in the staff lounge, Beatrice found her sitting alone, hands folded tightly in her lap. "I heard," Beatrice said softly. "Everyone's talking." Maria shook her head. "It was instinct." "Nothing more," Beatrice frowned. "Don't sell yourself short." I've seen people freeze in less. You didn't? Maria didn't reply. She couldn't. The flood of memories pressed too close. The surgeries, the children she had saved, the one she couldn't. That loss had driven her here, to anonymity, to floors and mops instead of operating tables. And yet, no matter how far she ran, the truth refused to stay buried. By the end of her shift, the building buzzed with rumors. Executives passed her in the halls with sidelong glances, their earlier smirks replaced by curiosity, even respect. Security guards who once chuckled now stood awkwardly silent as she passed. The story was spreading, and with it, the cracks in Richard Harper's carefully maintained narrative of control widened. When Maria left for the night, the city air felt heavier, charged with change. She rode the bus home in silence, watching headlights blur past the windows. Gabriel was waiting for her when she arrived, half asleep on the couch again. She kissed his forehead, her chest tightening with gratitude that he was safe, healthy, breathing without struggle. She thought of Evelyn, pale and trembling, clutching her toy dinosaur. A bond had formed, unspoken, but undeniable. Maria lay awake long into the night. She knew what was coming. Richard Harper had seen her. Not the janitor, not the uniform, but the precision, the authority, the knowledge she carried. He would come with questions, with demands, perhaps with anger at being exposed as helpless before his peers. And when he did, Maria would have to decide, remain invisible, or step fully into the light of who she once was. Her decision wasn't just about pride. It was about Evelyn. The little girl's faint voice echoed in her ears. "Don't go." Maria closed her eyes, her hand pressing over her heart. She couldn't walk away now, not when a child's future hung in the balance. Morning would come, and with it, confrontation. The storm she had felt building was no longer distant. It was here. Morning arrived with a restless energy that pulled Maria from sleep long before dawn. She moved quietly through her small apartment, preparing Gabriel's breakfast, her mind already circling the night before. The image of Evelyn collapsing, replayed again and again, as vivid as the sterile lights of an operating room. She had stepped in instinctively, but there was no undoing what had been revealed. Richard Harper had seen her, not as a janitor, but as someone who carried knowledge he couldn't understand. On the bus ride to work, the city blurred by, gray towers cutting into the pale morning sky. Conversations hummed around her, but Maria sat in silence, hands folded tightly. She felt the weight of the decision ahead. She had spent years hiding in plain sight, burying the past beneath routine. But the moment she laid Evelyn's head in her lap, the truth had clawed its way back to the surface. When she entered the lobby of Harper International, the atmosphere had shifted. Whispers followed her. A receptionist who once avoided eye contact gave her a tentative nod. Two security guards who used to snicker stood straighter when she passed. It wasn't respect, not yet, but it was no longer disdain. It was curiosity laced with unease. Maria went about her duties with deliberate calm, polishing the glass walls, sweeping the marble. She felt the stares, heard the murmured fragments of conversation. She knew what to do. Save the boss's kid. Maybe she's not just a janitor. Each word pressed against her like a tide she couldn't stop. On the 12th floor, she caught sight of Richard through the glass wall of his office. He stood with his back to her, phone pressed to his ear, his voice sharp and commanding. Yet even from a distance, she saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the unease in his stance. The man who had once sneered at her now carried the weight of a father who had watched his daughter nearly slip away. Maria turned back to her cart, focusing on her work. but she knew it was only a matter of time before the confrontation came. It arrived sooner than expected. By mid-morning, as Maria mopped the lobby floor, the glass doors slid open and Richard entered. His suit was flawless as always, but his eyes were different, haunted, sleepless. He strode toward her, each step deliberate, the lobby falling silent around him. "Janitor," he said, his tone clipped, though it lacked the scorn of before. "A word." Maria set her mop aside, her movements calm, her face unreadable. "I'm working," she replied evenly. Richard's jaw tightened. "This isn't a request." He gestured toward the side corridor, away from prying eyes. Reluctantly, Maria followed, her heart steady. She refused to show him fear. When they reached the quiet hallway, Richard turned on her. His mask of authority cracked just enough to show desperation beneath. "What did you do yesterday?" His voice was sharp, but there was an edge of pleading. "How did you know what to do for my daughter?" Maria met his gaze without flinching. "I saw what was happening. I acted." "That's not an answer," he snapped. "You're not trained for this. You're a janitor." The words struck like stones, but Maria didn't waver. "I was trained," she said quietly, each word deliberate. "Long before I carried a mop, I carried lives in my hands." Richard froze, his breath catching. For the first time, he seemed to truly see her. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low. Maria held his gaze, her silence heavier than words. She wouldn't hand him the truth so easily. Not yet. The revelation would come when it mattered most, when it could no longer be denied. Before Richard could press further, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "The hospital," he muttered, answering quickly. "Yes? What do you mean tests are inconclusive?" "No, I want the best specialists, whatever it costs." His voice rose, frantic. "Do you understand me?" Money is no object, Maria listened, her chest tightening. She already knew. Wealth could summon specialists, but it couldn't erase blind spots, couldn't conjure understanding. Evelyn needed more than money. She needed precision, expertise, and care. Richard ended the call, his face pale. For once, his power seemed hollow. He turned back to Maria, his voice unsteady. "If you know something, anything, tell me." Maria's expression softened, though her tone remained firm. "Your daughter doesn't need your money. She needs you to listen." "That's something you've never been good at." Richard's eyes flashed with anger, but beneath it was fear, raw and undeniable. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to reply. Maria stepped back, returning to her cart. "When the time comes, you'll understand," she said quietly. "But you'd better hope you're ready to hear it." She left him standing in the hallway, his authority stripped bare, his pride tangled in silence. Around them, the hum of the building resumed, but nothing was the same. The storm had broken, and now, every step forward pulled them closer to the truth Richard Harper had tried so hard to ignore. Subscribe if you've ever seen arrogance collapse when reality demanded humility. The story isn't over. It's only gaining strength. Maria returned to her work as if nothing had happened, but the echo of Richard's pale face and desperate voice lingered in her mind. He had stood in that hallway, stripped of all certainty, his words stumbling for once. She had seen men like him before, powerful, untouchable, until life bent them low. And though he hadn't admitted it, he was beginning to understand that money and influence couldn't shield him from what was happening to Evelyn. As she polished the brass handles of the glass doors, she caught fragments of conversation drifting from passing staff. "He's furious at the hospital. They don't know what's wrong with her yet. He called 3 specialists already. The whispers swirled, filling the lobby with unease. The mighty Richard Harper was flailing, and people were watching. Maria kept her face calm, but inside her chest tightened. She knew those signs in Evelyn weren't random. The faint flush, the weakness, the collapse. It pointed to something she had studied and treated countless times in her former life. And every moment wasted on denial put the child at greater risk. Later that day, as she swept near the executive elevator, Richard appeared again. His suit was immaculate, but his eyes were bloodshot, his posture stiff with exhaustion. He ignored everyone around him, striding straight to his office. The staff shrank back as he passed, their usual sycophancy tempered by fear of his simmering rage. Maria watched quietly, noting the tremor in his hands when he adjusted his cufflinks. For all his power, he was unraveling. By afternoon, Maria's shift took her to the 12th floor, where the tension was thick. She paused by the boardroom as raised voices erupted inside. "Investors want reassurance," one man said. "But they've heard about Evelyn." "Rumors are spreading. They smell weakness." Richard's reply was thunderous. "My daughter's health is not their concern. The company will stand." "Do your jobs?" Maria moved past, her cart squeaking softly. She couldn't ignore the irony. His obsession with appearances was colliding head-on with the one truth he couldn't control. Evelyn's condition wasn't just personal anymore. It was becoming a public crack in his empire. In the late evening, Maria finished cleaning the lobby and headed for the side entrance. But as she passed the security desk, the guard stopped her. "Mister, Harper wants to see you." Now Maria's jaw tightened, but she nodded. She followed the guard to the private elevator and rode up in silence, the walls closing in around her. When the doors opened, Richard was waiting in the corridor, his expression stormy, his tie loosened, his phone clutched in one hand. He dismissed the guard and gestured sharply. "Inside." Maria stepped into his office, the vast space lined with bookshelves and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The skyline glittered beyond, but the room felt heavy with tension. Richard closed the door, pacing like a caged animal. "The specialists don't know what's wrong," he admitted finally, his voice low and ragged. "They're running tests, but nothing adds up." She collapsed again this morning. He stopped, turning to face Maria, his eyes bloodshot. "You saw it before anyone else. You kept her alive until the ambulance arrived. How?" Maria remained standing, her posture steady. "Because I've seen it before." Many times Richard's breath caught. "You're not just a janitor, are you?" The silence between them stretched. Maria let it linger, watching the man who had humiliated her now search her face for answers. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing in. This was the edge of revelation, the line she had drawn for years. "I know what you're thinking," she said finally, "but this isn't about me. It's about Evelyn. And unless you stop hiding behind pride, she will suffer for it." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Tell me what you know," he demanded. The edge of arrogance was still there, but fear outweighed it now. Maria's gaze didn't waver. "I know what the symptoms mean. I know what's coming if she isn't treated properly. But you won't listen. Not yet. You're too busy fighting the world to admit you need help." Richard's face hardened, but his shoulders sagged. For the first time, he didn't fire back with an insult. He simply sank into his chair, his hands covering his face. "I can't lose her," he whispered, the words muffled. "She's all I have." Maria's chest tightened. She thought of Gabriel asleep on the couch, of the daughter she had lost when no one listened soon enough. She knew the shape of his fear intimately. And though part of her wanted to walk away, to let his arrogance consume him. Evelyn's face pulled her back. "Then prove it," Maria said softly. "When the time comes, don't look at me as your janitor. Look at me as the only person who can help you keep her alive." Richard lifted his head slowly, his eyes searching hers. He didn't speak, but the silence was an answer of its own. He was beginning to understand, even if pride still held his tongue. Maria turned toward the door, her steps calm, deliberate. The storm was no longer approaching. It was here, circling them both. And soon, the world would see the truth Richard Harper had tried so hard to bury. Maria stepped out of Richard's office with her pulse still racing, though her expression stayed composed. She pushed her cart down the hall, ignoring the sidelong glances from executives who lingered near the elevators. They had no idea what had transpired behind that closed door, but whispers always found their way through marble walls. Richard Harper, the untouchable CEO, had summoned the janitor. That alone was enough to stir curiosity. By the time Maria returned to the lobby, the building buzzed with speculation. Staff members huddled in corners, their voices lowered but insistent. "She's different. He needed her. Something happened with his daughter." The story grew in the retelling, fragments of truth stitched with rumor. Maria kept her head down, her mop gliding across the floor, but she felt the weight of every glance. For years, she had been invisible. Now, invisibility was no longer possible. That evening, as the building prepared for a major investor reception, Maria's duties shifted. Chandeliers were polished, carpets vacuumed, every inch of the lobby made to gleam. The event was meant to project strength, an image of stability despite the tremors threatening Harper International. Maria worked quietly along the edges, her presence blending with the hum of preparations, yet she knew the night would not pass without consequence. By the time guests arrived, the lobby glittered with wealth. Men in tailored suits and women in evening gowns drifted across the marble, champagne glasses in hand. Laughter rose, polished and rehearsed, as if none of them sensed the fragility beneath the surface. Richard appeared soon after, Evelyn at his side in a pale dress, her toy Dinosaur tucked under her arm. He smiled for the cameras, but his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. Maria watched from a distance, rag in hand, as Richard made his rounds. Investors shook his hand, clapped his shoulder, raised their glasses to his success. But behind every smile lay suspicion. They had heard whispers of collapsing numbers, of a child collapsing in the halls. Tonight was his attempt to silence them. As speeches began, Maria stood near the far wall, wiping an already spotless surface. Richard took the stage, his voice strong, commanding, weaving promises of growth and stability. The crowd nodded, sipping champagne, their skepticism hidden but palpable. Evelyn sat in the front row beside her nanny, her small hands twisting the fabric of her dress. Maria's eyes lingered on her, worry curling in her chest. The girl's cheeks were pale again, her posture slumped with fatigue. Halfway through Richard's address, Evelyn shifted in her seat, clutching her chest. Maria's heart lurched. She set her rag aside, moving a step forward. Richard continued speaking, unaware, until Evelyn let out a faint gasp and slid sideways. The room froze. A glass shattered somewhere in the crowd. "Evelyn!" Richard's voice cracked through the silence. He leapt from the stage, pushing through stunned guests to his daughter's side. Panic rippled through the lobby, voices rising, questions flying. The nanny knelt helplessly, tears already streaming. Maria pushed through the crowd with steady force. "Move!" she ordered, her voice carrying more authority than any executive. The guests parted instinctively, stunned by the certainty in her tone. She dropped to Evelyn's side, her hands moving with practiced precision. Pulse check, airway clear, signs unmistakable. Richard knelt across from her, his face ashen. Do something! His arrogance was gone, replaced by raw desperation. I am, Maria replied firmly. She tilted Evelyn's head, stabilizing her breathing, then pressed her fingers against the child's neck again. Weak, uneven, time was slipping. She glanced up. Call an ambulance. Tell them it's a pediatric cardiac emergency, and clear this room. Executives and investors who had moments ago raised glasses now scrambled to obey. Phones dialed, chairs moved, a path cleared. The hum of wealth and power disintegrated into chaos, leaving only the fragile sound of Evelyn's shallow breaths. Maria worked steadily, her voice calm. Stay with me, sweetheart. You're strong. She brushed the child's hair back, anchoring herself in the rhythm of her training. The world around her blurred, at the gasps of onlookers fading. There was only the girl, the crisis, and the knowledge that no one else in this tower could do what she was doing. Richard's hands trembled as he gripped Evelyn's tiny fingers. His eyes locked on Maria, pleading without words. For the first time, his empire, his power, his pride, all of it meant nothing. The fate of his daughter rested entirely in the hands of the woman he had once mocked for crawling across his floor. As the sound of approaching sirens pierced the night, Maria felt Evelyn's pulse steady slightly under her fingertips. Relief surged, but she kept her composure, focusing on the child's fragile stability. She lifted her eyes to Richard, her voice calm, but edged with steel. Do you see now? This isn't about power or money. It's about listening. The words hung in the charged silence of the lobby. Around them, investors, staff, and strangers bore witness. The janitor had stepped into the center of the storm, and there was no turning back. The lobby had fallen into stunned silence. Every glittering chandelier and polished marble surface reflecting the weight of what had just happened. Maria knelt with Evelyn in her lap, her hands steady as she monitored the child's shallow breaths. Richard hovered inches away, his face ashen, sweat beading on his forehead. The executives and investors who had filled the room moments before stood frozen, their champagne flutes dangling uselessly in their hands. Power, wealth, and pride had evaporated in the face of a child's fragility. Clear the way! A paramedic shouted as the ambulance crew burst through the glass doors. The crowd stumbled back, heels clicking against marble as the stretcher wheeled forward. Maria eased Evelyn into their care, giving precise instructions. Weak pulse, irregular rhythm, possible congenital condition, stabilized airway. The paramedics exchanged glances again, startled by her clinical detail, but moved quickly. As they secured Evelyn, Richard turned to Maria, his voice breaking. You're coming. I won't hear otherwise. Maria rose slowly, her uniform dust-stained, her expression calm but unyielding. My shift isn't over. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some investors shook their heads, others whispered furiously. A janitor defying the CEO was unthinkable, but no one could deny what they had just witnessed. Richard's desperation left him raw. Please, he said, the word foreign on his tongue. She trusts you. Maria studied him for a long moment. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by fear in the eyes of witnesses. She nodded once. A decision made not for him, but for Evelyn. I'll come. Together they followed the stretcher out, the crowd parting in reverent silence. The flash of cameras from reporters outside caught the scene. Richard Harper, titan of industry, trailing after a janitor whose presence now carried undeniable weight. The hospital lights were harsh, sterile, their brightness cutting through the haze of adrenaline. Evelyn was whisked into an emergency ward, leaving Richard and Maria in a waiting room thick with tension. Staff moved briskly around them, glancing curiously at the pair who sat side by side, yet worlds apart. Richard leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands trembling. They say the specialists are still reviewing tests. No clear answers yet. He shook his head, voice cracking. All the money in the world, and no one can tell. Me, what's wrong with her? Maria's gaze softened, but her tone stayed firm. Money can buy tests. It can't buy answers. Not the ones that matter. He looked at her then, truly looked, as though seeing past the uniform for the first time. Who are you? He whispered. Maria hesitated, her chest tightening with the weight of years carried in silence. The memory of her daughter pressed close. The night she had lost her because no one listened soon enough. She thought of Gabriel, of why she had buried her past beneath the anonymity of janitorial work. But here, now, the moment she had avoided was inevitable. I was Dr. Maria Alvarez, she said quietly. Pediatric surgeon. I left the profession when I lost my daughter. I couldn't keep saving other children while knowing I hadn't saved my own. Richard's breath caught, his eyes widening. The revelation landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples through the sterile air. Around them, a few nearby nurses paused, their expressions shifting in sudden recognition. The whispers began again. You, Richard stammered, you were a surgeon? All this time? Maria met his gaze steadily. I didn't want to be seen anymore. I just wanted to provide for my son. Cleaning floors was easier than living with the weight of what I lost. The words silenced even Richard. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of hospital machinery, the shuffle of nurses in the hallway. Finally, Richard leaned back, his shoulders sagging, his arrogance hollowed into something closer to humility. I mocked you, he admitted hoarsely. I laughed while you played with my daughter. I treated you like nothing. His hands covered his face, his voice breaking. And you saved her. Twice Maria's voice remained calm. This was never about me. It was about Evelyn. She deserves better than a father who can't see beyond pride. Richard lowered his hands, his eyes wet but clear. Then help me. Help her. Whatever it takes, Maria nodded slowly. The reversal was complete. Not in secret, not hidden in shadows, but in full view of witnesses. The janitor had become the authority, the one the powerful man had no choice but to trust. Hours later, as dawn crept toward the horizon, a doctor emerged from the emergency ward. We've stabilized her, he said. Relief rippled through the waiting room. But she'll need surgery soon. The condition is serious. But treatable Richard turned to Maria instantly, his voice trembling. Stay, please. Guide me through this. Maria placed a hand over her heart, her eyes heavy with both pain and resolve. For her, I will. The hospital lights buzzed overhead, but the balance of power had already shifted. In front of strangers, staff, and witnesses, the truth had been unveiled. Maria Alvarez was no longer invisible. The sterile hum of the hospital surrounded Maria as she walked beside Richard, both of them trailing. Behind the gurney, carrying Evelyn toward the surgical ward. Doctors and nurses moved with practiced urgency, their voices calm but clipped. Richard's hand twitched at his side, as though resisting the urge to seize control of the moment, to issue orders as he did in every boardroom. But here, in these halls, authority was measured differently. He knew it now. Maria's steady presence proved it. When they stopped outside the surgical suite, Richard turned to her. His voice was raw, stripped of all the polish and command that once defined him. "You'll stay?" Maria met his gaze evenly. "For her, yes. But you'll need to listen to them. Really listen. This isn't a negotiation." He nodded, too quickly, as though afraid she might disappear if he faltered. For the first time since she'd met him, he didn't argue, didn't belittle, didn't sneer. He simply looked like a father, desperate to hold on to his daughter. Hours passed as the surgery unfolded. Richard paced the waiting room, his phone buzzing endlessly on the table, ignored for the first time in his career. Maria sat quietly, her eyes closed, hands folded, whispering a prayer she hadn't dared speak in years. The memory of her own daughter's final night pressed heavily against her chest. She remembered the sterile lights, the unanswered questions, the helplessness that had driven her into exile from the life she once knew. Tonight was her reckoning. At last, the surgeon emerged, peeling off his mask. "The procedure was a success," he said. Relief washed through the room like a tide breaking free. Richard sagged against the wall, a shuddering breath escaping him. Maria closed her eyes, a single tear slipping free. Evelyn had been given the chance her own daughter had been denied. When they were finally allowed into recovery, Evelyn stirred weakly, her small fingers curling around the stuffed dinosaur lying beside her. Richard sat at her bedside, tears glistening in his eyes. For a long time he said nothing, simply holding her hand as though anchoring himself to her fragile strength. Then slowly, he turned to Maria. "I owe you everything." His voice cracked. "And I don't even know how to begin repaying it." Maria's tone was steady, but her eyes carried the weight of truth. "You can start by remembering. Every person you dismiss, every worker you overlook. Remember this moment. Remember who stood by your daughter when money couldn't." Richard bowed his head, his arrogance broken. The man who once laughed at her in front of a crowd now nodded humbly, the silence between them carrying more weight than any promise. Word of what happened spread quickly. Investors who had once whispered about weakness now spoke of change. Employees who had chuckled behind Maria's back looked at her with awe and respect. The story of the janitor who saved the CEO's daughter became more than rumor. It became a reckoning. Yet Maria asked for no credit, no recognition. She returned to her work with quiet dignity, mop in hand, though the building no longer looked at her the same way. Her invisibility was gone, replaced by a truth no one could erase. She had carried a life in her hands, and she had not faltered. Days later, as Maria passed through the lobby, Evelyn spotted her from across the room. The little girl tugged free from her father's grasp, running into Maria's arms with surprising strength. "My friend," she whispered, clutching her dinosaur between them. Maria hugged her gently, her throat tight. When she looked up, Richard was watching. No words were exchanged, but the nod he gave her was one of respect, not command. A silent acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted forever. Maria left the building that evening with the city lights blazing overhead. She walked toward the bus stop, her bag heavy on her shoulder, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She knew she would never be invisible again. Not to Evelyn, not to Richard, not to anyone who had witnessed the storm. For the first time, she allowed herself a breath of peace. She had not reclaimed her old title, nor did she need to. She had reclaimed something far greater, her dignity. What should our next story be titled? Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?